Well, welcome to the final video for the summer 2020 class of Presbyterian Polity at Lancaster Theological Seminary. I just want to make a few kind of wrap-up comments about some forward direction for us. But first, I want to say thank you and well done to you as a class. You've engaged so well, and it's been such a pleasure to work with you individually and corporately as a class. Thank you. I'm glad we got a few extra times for some of us to be together, and I'm really glad for all the work that you did. You can kind of see I've got a Polity t-shirt on. It says Energy, Intelligence, Imagination, and Love. If you're at the General Assembly, you'll know that the moderator's wearing these, and I got one. They're part of our ordination vows. So if you are ordained as a ruling elder, when you become ordained as a teaching elder, minister of the word and sacrament, you will be asked. We serve the church with energy, intelligence, and imagination and love. And you've certainly done that as a class, and I've enjoyed being with you during these weeks. So as we move forward, I want to talk first in terms of polity, just kind of what are some ways the polity itself is moving forward, but then some broader comments about polity leadership as you move forward in your ministry. On our polity itself moving forward, the way that Carlos Wilton ends his excellent book, that I think is great at introducing polity, is interesting to me. I think he does a wonderful job of giving us context and explaining the polity. I don't know that he's asking, nor did he intend to ask. This isn't as much a criticism of the book as an awareness of where it fits and how it helps us. He's not asking, is this system working in our present cultural context? He's not asking those questions. I think those questions are also necessary to ask. We've got to understand first. And so I'm going to make just make you aware of the Peace, Unity, Purity Task Force of the Peace USA as an example of something that we've done, and then an article that actually became a book by a sociologist, Presbyterian sociologist named Bo Weston, where I think he points out some interesting things. I think there's a lot of things there that I push back on and want to actually enable more experimentation for. And then I just want to show you what's going on with the Book of Order. So Carlos Wilton ends the book by quoting Augustine and then kind of flipping that quote and saying where the presbytery is, there is the Presbyterian Church. So he locates the kind of center of who we are in this corporate body where we live together and work together. I, of course, as a state clerk, appreciate that. I also wonder what the future holds for presbyteries, given the pressures on our congregations and on us nationally, both missionally and also fiscally, which are not disconnected, but are distinct. And I wonder what these connections are going to look like. I would call for experimentation and adaptation in those things. And in some sense, I think that Wilton kind of sets the stage for, well, what do we talk about in changing and adapting and working and making different. Couple of ways that those kinds of conversations have emerged in our denomination. There's actually towards kind of about 10 years ago, there were a number of reports that surfaced, the church in the 21st century, and there was one about mid-councils, and you probably have never heard of them, and they aren't talked about very much at all. The Peace, Unity, and Purity Task Force was commissioned in 2001, and notice they were supposed to work on our spiritual discernment of our Christian identity in for the 21st century. You'll note this with some I'm going to say in a couple of minutes, but note I already talked about the Church in the 21st Century report and another report on mid-councils. So this task force was duplicated in some other ways or overlapped in some other ways. There's that amount of energy and anxiety and a number of questions around that. They engaged in Bible study. They met many times. They produced a 56-page final report and an 18-page principles of polity, noting that our polity is one of our strengths. There's some of the themes in there were connectionalism. Some of the themes in there were the ways that we use power and the call to mutuality. And they talked about points of balance and tension that have historically been with us, including how we deal with matters where there is disagreement. They called for communal discernment and in some ways called to move away from an us versus them style of voting. What I would notice to you is that in terms of reception, that has all but disappeared in terms of our conversations about who we are and how we move forward. It's one of the challenges of of doing this work and moving it forward. So these kind of massive reports, a massive amount of work across the breadth of our denomination, and just kind of disappears. Bo Weston, who's a Presbyterian professor at a Presbyterian college, well, he's a sociology professor at a Presbyterian college. He wrote an article that I gave you to read if you want to, and actually then turned that into a book. And sociologically made the point that in any organization there's an establishment. There's this integrative body of authoritative leaders. They have cultural commitments to one another. They understand the culture of the organization. They've got positions in the organization. He said they're not just the elite, but they're committed to one another and the organization. And key for him, they're people who respect authority. What he says is that we undid ours in the 60s, and we dispersed power and authority, and we mandated inclusion. And that had to do about race and gender primarily in the 1960s. He then, and I want you to understand that history, the reason for it, the way it's impacted us. He identifies primarily larger church pastors who are administratively competent as this establishment. I would say that stated clerks and executive presbyters have embodied that as well in different ways. Although there's pressure on executive staff of presbyteries these days, fewer presbyteries have them. Stated clerks tend to be part-time sometimes. And also there's a historical antipathy between stated clerks and executives that I'll tell you about individually some way, that, for your information, does not exist in Donegal Presbytery. But we've had to work against that here because of the pressures systemically on these kinds of positions to force people into those kinds of boxes. Weston says that he thinks these mandates of inclusiveness aren't useful anymore. That he's not against it, but what he says is it's not doing what we want organizationally. And he says that theological diversity is a good cultural practice, but a bad structural principle. It's interesting to me. He would go back to vocational representation, which means teaching elders and ruling elders. So ministers of word and sacrament and ruling elders as key in terms of how we look at representation, and experienced, competent pastors as the linchpin of the system. He returns to that. He would want stated clerks and executive presbyters as advisors of General Assembly because we tend to be the ones that bring the institutional knowledge and the broader commitment. We can speak when we're called upon at General Assembly, but only then, and rarely, if ever, are we called upon in those capacities. And he would want smaller presbyteries, he thinks, and you've seen this theme, I think, through some of the writings, these people who are looking at the size of presbyteries, which are shrinking even as those things are being written, and wondering if programmatic is the right way to go or relational is the right way to go. And then he says the mistrust that Presbyterians now bestow on our leaders, especially at the national level, is among the chief reasons for our decline and dysfunction of our denominational structures. And there's just a lot to talk about there. I don't agree with everything he says. I think that some of the inclusion issues remain paramount because of structural past. But I also take very seriously what he says about the kind of administrative competence it takes to lead complex organizations. Let me just also note for you that the foundation sections in our Book of Order is completely new as of 2011. The form of government was completely rewritten as of 2011. The Directory for Worship, completely rewritten as of 2017. And the rules of discipline, there is now a complete rewriting of it that was to come to the General Assembly this summer. It was pushed off until 2022. If it's adopted, that means it will be completely rewritten as of 2023. So in the span of 10, 12 years, we will have a completely rewritten Book of Order, which is a lot of change. And so I've become familiar with people saying to me, it used to be in there, and that kind of change, even if they appreciate it, confusing for people. We look to resources that confuse us less than we look to resources that we trust. I think that level of structural foment has implications for us and is something to note just in terms of our polity change. There's been many, many GA reports. I mentioned some of them. Right now, there's a Moving Forward Implementation Commission, which is the result of a Way Forward task force that became a commission that got turned into the Moving Forward Commission. There's a 2020 Vision team, and there's a task force on financial sustainability, as well as other committees that are looking to the future. I would say the amount of energy going into thinking about these related issues of structure, sustainability is a sign that, quite frankly, we're an anxious mess. And as you head into leadership, that's a good thing for us to be aware of, that we've got lots of thoughts, lots of dreams, and lots of different perspectives about what the future holds. In terms of future polity leadership, so that's kind of what's going on the polity side of it. These are more questions about what kind of leadership do I think is called forward in these days. Paas, and to this I'm going to talk mainly about some things that Stefan Paas says towards the end of his book. If you haven't had a chance to finish that, I certainly recommend it to you. There's no grading on it at the end of this class, so I would imagine it's not high on the list of things to get done, but I think there's some excellent material there. In page 209, he says the world is not Christian and it will not become Christian. That's a very different starting point for mission than most of what has led mainline and evangelical Christians over the last century, if not longer, where you think about more liberal Christians starting the Christian Century, which is a magazine, in the early 1900s, thinking that there was going to be this grand expansion of Christendom in that century. And the Edinburgh Council on World Mission, 1910, again, this kind of grand expansion to world mission into the world. Paas has a more circumspect thinking about the future, and it's not as grandiose. And if we've got his perspective, we've got that perspective, I think it shapes our leadership and our polity differently, because we have different expectations of how people are going to respond to us, and that's what we do. And I encourage you to think about that as you think about our polity. Here's what he says about community. Community is important because as human beings, we only reach our destiny in relationships. So he's highly relational. And then he says, in my view, so his view, small communities are better qualified for this than large ones. The larger an organization is, the more formal its relations and policy, and the more specialized and bureaucratic its functions and offices. So that has polity implications, because that has implications for how big we make our structures, how complex we make our structures, and how kind of geographically expansive we make our structures. Now, and Stefan and I have talked about this, what pushes back against that is the administrative necessities of late modern life. So the need for background checks and the legalities of running organizations in these very complex days, and the kind of expertise and knowledge that it takes to do that. And those are pressures against one another. But I would say, I fundamentally agree with him that there's some advantages to being nimble, small, and more highly relational. And I think that has polity implications. And then finally, what he says about God, he says that so the church on earth to glorify God in every tone and every form. This is concentrated most in its liturgy, the Sunday worship gathering, this community of exiles and priests who in all sorts of ways are meaningfully connected to their community. So you see that kind of connection of worship, neighborhood ministry, and then relational connection. And as we sing, sigh, lament, shout, pray, cheer to God on behalf of the world that may not know or recognize God, and we invite others to join him. Again, polity implications there. Most importantly, though, I think the emphasis where Paas comes, where I come, is that this is about pointing towards God, giving glory to God, trusting that God, who is beyond our power and often beyond our understanding of what God is doing, is at work. And I think that's really important for us in these days. I think that the future, you'll need, and I'll need, technical competence. We need to know the polity. We need an adventurous heart, which is breathed and encouraged by the power of the Holy Spirit. And then we need experimenters. So that Governance and Ministry book, Pilgrims and Priests book, that's why I broaden out the polity conversation, because we need to experiment. In other words, friends and class, I think we need